Good morning, everybody. Before starting, let us to stand up, please, for national anthem of Egypt and then Greece. Young scholars and students, welcome to this event or this lecture. We are honored today to welcome our distinguished scholar, Professor Nikolas Dimakis, professor at the Department of Archaeology and History, National and Capodistarian University of Athens, Greece. Dيماكيس holds a first degree in History and Archaeology from Athens 2002 and MA and PhD in Archaeology both at the University of Nottingham 2008 and 2012 under prestigious scholarships and awards. Before joining the Department of History and Archaeology in 2020, he worked as a postdoctoral fellow in various research projects of excellence at the University of Athens and the University of Crete, and as a contract archaeologist at the Greek Ministry of Culture. His specialization in classical and Hellenistic archaeology, with particular expertise in ancient Greek mortuary practices and social interpretation of burial evidence. Our guest's research focuses on death, burial, rituals, and cultural meanings of funerary practices in Hellenistic Greece, combining archaeological and historical approaches. His work contributes significantly to current international debates on identity, social differentiation, and ritual behavior in ancient Greek world. We are especially pleased to host his lecture within the framework of our Erasmus Plus program for academic mobility, which strengthens scholarly exchange between European and Mediterranean institutions. Today's lecture will offer us a stimulating and insightful perspective on how Hellenistic societies understood death, memory, and social identity through burial practices. So please welcome him with me today.
So much for this very kind introduction, my dear Fidea. I have to thank you personally for making this happening and for our mutual efforts culminating in past year in order to achieve these results of this Erasmus Plus bilateral agreement. If it were not for you from Alexandria University, I think this would not have been possible at the current stage of international discussion and collaboration. My dear colleagues, dear friends, it's always a pleasure to be among friendly and familiar faces, as usual. Alexandria has become for me my second to third, if I count my wife's house as well, into that account, home. So I'm always pleased to be here and collaborate with new young and senior colleagues of the field of archaeology. Now, without further ado, you will allow me to change tables and move on to the other side of this room. This is how funerary rituals, as a matter of fact, worked in the past. There was movements and noise as well. So, although today we are not going to be speaking about performance and performative rituals, that's a huge topic on its own. We will focus on more basic things in terms of archaeological evidence, because I would like to take this opportunity to share with you evidence coming mainly from mainland Greece, evidence dated to the Hellenistic period, and of course, above all, I will be talking about funerary evidence from various cemeteries and burial sites from mainland Greece. So, the topic of my lecture this morning is entitled Death and Burial in Hellenistic Greece. Such a fascinating topic. I mean, when it comes to me, it's all about death and burial, as most of you already know. And, well, death and burial on their own, I think they leave their blueprints to us, modern-day archaeologists, to come closer in contact with our distant past, rather than any other sort of evidence category. So, burials are recognized as a valuable source for discussing an array of topics. Cross-disciplinary approaches to burial allow us to unpack sophisticated socio-cultural aspects of the human past, including social relationships and identities, social structure, diet and health, population histories, and individual biographies. No, I'm good. Is the sound all right?
Yeah. Yes.
So, among other things, we can talk about population histories, individual biographies, emotional discourses, or emotional responses, if you like, ritualized practices, migrations, and of course, cosmologies. Static correlation between the buried individual and his funerary, as a matter of fact, their funerary inventory, has now been replaced by a reflexive attitude. The individual and the funerary inventory themselves, as a matter of fact, are not being placed on their own in the grave. In other words, the dead do not bury themselves, somebody else does it for them. Therefore, their treatment of the deceased tells us quite a lot about the living society, not that much about the society of the dead. But we have rarely made death attitudes towards it, its management and cultural elaboration, the focus of our mortuary burial archaeologies. Instead, we have used mortuary practices as a window into past social organization, ethnic affiliation, cultural relationships, and so on. The fact that the evidence is drawn from the context of death and disposal has been, if not incidental, then certainly marginal to our research. However, the mortuary context is a specific cultural location. The grave is not a Roman Pompeii, that's not burial context, in which past societies are instantly fossilized. Burial evidence is a type of evidence furnished both by artifacts and ideologies, of course, and therefore is informative for understanding social and cultural relations. Burials can provide us with insights into the individual's so-called social persona, social identity, perhaps, otherwise unnoticed, while their subterranean nature, the fact that they're all underground, often makes them the only source of information. To give you an example, most of the exhibits in at least Greek museums, as a matter of fact, even many of the exhibits of the Greco-Roman Museum here in Alexandria are literally coming from burial contexts and literally coming from graves. Why? Because usually grave contexts are left untouched in most of the times, whereas all the domestic and cultural and other sort of cultural archaeological remains are being easily removed, replaced, renovated, or reused. However, one should also bear in mind that one of the often repeated, if less than popular maxims of archaeological research is that negative evidence, meaning the absence of any material evidence, is just as valuable as the richest and most copious finds. In simple words, we can talk about archaeological material coming from graves, but we should equally wonder what else might have been placed in there, not preserved to date for us to see. Why? Remember, the dead do not bury themselves. Somebody else does it for them. There is a performative ritual aspect in between, okay? Where living people place the dead in their final resting place along with the objects the dead themselves, or even the living, wished for them to accompany the individual. It is not necessary for an ideology to exist or be hidden under symbolisms, material symbolisms in a grave. It may simply not be there. That's the other way of looking at things. In recent years, the topic of ancient Greek death and burial in classical antiquity has been increasingly addressed in international conferences, monographs, collected volumes, and scientific journals. After having been neglected for decades, or the province of a relatively small group of scholars, Greek death and burial has gradually become central to the research agenda of classical archaeology. Admittedly here, our colleagues from prehistory are much better placed than we are in ways of approaching death and burial in the past. Why? We will see in a minute. This development can mainly be traced from the early 70s of the last century and has picked up pace in a sustained fashion at the beginning of the new millennium, with studies on pre-Hellenistic cemeteries having the lion's share. I'm always talking about Greece, okay, not Egypt. Yet only rarely is the complex and fragmentary picture of Hellenistic Greece being systematically considered. I mean, we do know many things about Greece in the Hellenistic times from literary sources, epigrams, minor arts, monumental painting, sculpture, public architecture. But imagine if we could possibly bring this set of evidence together with all the information coming from burial evidence. Okay? Although many Hellenistic burials have been found, and more are being discovered each year, information about them remains incomplete. Mortuary practices of the Hellenistic period in Greece and in other countries, I have to admit here, have largely been treated through the documentation and publication of individual cemeteries through archaeological reports, as simple as that. Single burials taken out of the wider burial context, meaning the cemetery. Macedonian tombs, in the case of mainland Greece and other countries like Asia Minor. Funerary art, or of specific types of funerary material, mainly grave stelae, pottery, and terracotta figurines. Specific types of evidence are often pulled out of their context or studied separately, individually, while descriptive and comparative analysis are often employed in order to reconstruct a vague picture of the cultural history of sites through their cemeteries. There is limited work in book form that attempts a synthetic and thematic approach of the Hellenistic burial record. It can crudely be said that the more complex a past society, like the Hellenistic, for instance, the less research has been devoted to its cemeteries proper. But questions about funerary art, burial wealth, aesthetics, or technology, important as they are, and they are really important, cannot be answered until we have understood the logic of the rituals involved in the creation of the archaeological record. Attempts to reconstruct sites would largely benefit from the richer knowledge of their cemeteries. Even if these are partly known from documentary sources, the latter are not always trustworthy. And I can share with you numerous examples of documentary sources stating one thing and the archaeological evidence of the exact same period contradicting it. In this general framework, my forthcoming volume attempts to fill the gap by exploring new lines of thought, questioning established ways of reading Hellenistic burials, take stock of recent developments, and to achieve a complete coverage of death and burial in Hellenistic Greece, rather than to provide a collection of current research agendas. However, main aim of this lecture today is, of course, not to advertise my forthcoming work, which has a long way still to go, but to raise questions, note some general trends, mark tendencies, and to trigger creative thinking on 3 out of the many more aspects of the Hellenistic funerary ritual, namely the location of Hellenistic cemeteries in the landscape, the disposal of the dead in the grave, and the placement of the offerings in the burial context. Of course, such a study has to overcome numerous difficulties. Few regional studies exist on Hellenistic burials, and most of the information has to be gathered from dispersed sources, mainly archaeological reports. Published reports, lacking specific analysis of skeletal materials from any cemetery, render difficult an evaluation of what authors mean when they identify the remains of a male, female, or even child. Because these are usually archaeologists, these are not specialists, on bioarchaeology. Our knowledge of populations in the Hellenistic period is limited to a number of site-specific bioarchaeological studies, and most assessment of burials are results of observations made by archaeologists like myself in the field. Accessibility to cemeteries was admittedly of major concern in ancient Greek and, of course, in Hellenistic Greece as well. Access for the ekphora, the second part of the 3-act drama of the ancient Greek funeral, which remained intact even till nowadays, which could entail a pompi, a ritual procession, of several hundred meters from the settlement and the house of the deceased, was certainly facilitated in this way, through accessibility. Even a few hundred meters distance through rough field is quite a long way to transport a dead body, considering the slow walking pace for the performance of lament, and of course for the elders to keep on track. If funerals did indeed take place before dawn, as we are well informed from funeral legislation and literary sources, applying also to Hellenistic Alexandria, Ptolemaic Alexandria, when visibility was rather low early in the mornings, quite low, then the effort would have been even greater to move through space. Hellenistic cemeteries are therefore placed alongside roads and in relatively flat areas. It is probably that this association of cemeteries with roads was mainly down to sheer convenience rather than anything else. People in the past had practical mindsets, like we do today. To give you an example, we keep talking about reusing and recycling of material nowadays, but the first reusers and recyclers were people in the far and distant past, okay? Excavation and surface survey evidence suggests that the overall number of settlements and cemeteries gradually reached a peak in the late classical, early Hellenistic period, meaning that the number of known cemeteries to date in mainland Greece are reaching a peak in the late 4th and early 3rd century BC. Then their number increases considerably and in ways that do not reflect the number of the associated settlements, meaning that fewer settlements were associated with many more cemeteries at the same time. Something very familiar to you from Alexandria as well. By the mid-Hellenistic period, meaning the late 3rd century BC, intensified settlement nucleation suggests the gradual consolidation of populations near or into the most prominent urban centers. That's the period when sites like Pergamon or even Ayer themselves or even Pele came to the fore. This is mirrored, of course, by the burial evidence and the gradual accumulation of burials into the cemeteries of major urban centers. We've started moving from dispersed burial grounds to more extended ones with intensive burial use associated with fewer urban centers. Okay? We're moving towards stronger and bolder urbanization, if you allow me saying. The pattern culminated in the late Hellenistic period and in the early Roman as a result of shifting cemetery settlement distributional patterns, partly due to changes in agricultural strategy and partly to alterations in population growth. Population started increasing considerably. And let me share this thought of mine. I think it's not arbitrary that Alexandria reached its major peak in the 2nd century BCE. This was done not only for political or economic reasons, but also for population accumulation and increase at the same time, not solely within the fortified area of Alexandria, but also outside that. Okay? This is a similar pattern to what we come across in Greece. These wider transformations of the urban landscape throughout the Hellenistic did not merely produce proportionally varied frequencies of burials over time, but also changes in the way these burials were distributed within cemeteries. And this has allowed me to identify 4 main categories of burial distribution in Hellenistic cemeteries. These can also be applied to Alexandrian burial grounds. Okay? First, urban cemeteries. That is cemeteries of large urban sites like Aegean, Rhodes, Thessaloniki, Megara, and so on and so forth. Even Alexandria can be added here, but in a different manner. These are densely occupied and extensive cemeteries, often with remarkable continuity and longevity in their use, having an impact to their spatial organization, either in orderly groupings of graves in rows upon rows, or in far more messy arrangements due to lack of space. They are composed of a wide variety of grave types, regularly arranged in row segmented clusters that are not always easy to distinguish. Funerary markers, proper grave stele, funerary sculpture, or even earthen mounds and stone-made enclosures are rather frequent in the crowded urban cemeteries, implying that the need to demarcate the dead was greater in these urban cemeteries rather than in the rural ones. Urban cemeteries are set alongside urban roads, leading to or from city gates, while this network was further elaborated by a dense grid of intra-cemetery funerary ways that were also crisscrossing the cemetery, often creating burial plots with the graves in linear or circular arrangements. In simple words, whenever we come across something looking like a road lying alongside a number of graves, this does not necessarily have to be an urban road, okay? It may simply be a ritual road or a funerary road, okay? But the patterns vary. So this is why I keep saying that we have to bring all the evidence together and see how they crisscross each other, okay? The second category, the so-called peri-urban cemeteries. These are several distinct burial grounds, such as one at Chania, for instance, in the island of Crete, okay? Which are located on the periphery around of formal urban cemeteries and represent resting places for people, both adult and sub-adult, of lower social strata, who were allocated rather marginal secondary burial place. These cemeteries usually do not yield significant mortuary variability, meaning rather extensive grave type divergence, but usually they display a couple of grave types being used at the same time, not more than that. The third category are proper rural cemeteries or rural burial grounds. These are cemeteries associated with subsidiary sites, peripheral sites, sites found in the middle of nowhere, okay, which demonstrate a clear spatial arrangement of graves and some, if not slight, mortuary variability, usually of 2 to 4 grave types, but no more than that, with a marked preference towards a cluster like this one, or arbitrary placement of the graves. The fourth category is to do with rural burials, not rural cemeteries. Why? Because not all burials are found associated with settlements, and certainly not all burials are found associated with cemeteries. As some seem to have been placed in some distance from any settlement or cemetery, at least so far as we can tell, farmstead or settlement. They are located usually in fertile and well-watered land, while their grave forms are anything but poorly or hastily made. To give you an example, on display, I've marked the location and the visibility fields on the picture on your left-hand side, bottom, of a proper Macedonian tomb of the 2nd century BCE, found in northern Greece, in the region of Thrace. As a matter of fact, this is the largest in size Macedonian tomb of the 2nd century BCE in mainland Greece. But it's located in the middle of nowhere. Literally. The red dot, if you can see it, I don't know if I can point from here, no I cannot, points the location of the Macedonian tomb in deep forest, right at the feet of a high mountain, and the Dromos faces this area in the triangle down there, which is arable land, arable, well-watered land for cultivation. In modern, but also in ancient times as well. Probably the first guy buried therein was the owner, the landowner of this land, and then his family followed, as we found many more skeletons being placed there at some later point than the initial burial. Okay, and we are all well aware who was systematically buried in Macedonian tombs. This was not an arbitrary man. This was not a man coming from the lower social classes of the Hellenistic society. This was either an heteros, okay, or a strategos, or somebody lying at the higher up, at the peak of the Hellenistic social hierarchy of the time. But his grave is in the middle of nowhere. Okay? To these four categories, one could possibly add a fifth one. One, however, that cannot be identified as a cemetery, rather as a sort of burial ground. Okay? I refer to burials in non-funerary contexts. That's very intriguing, isn't it? Burials in non-funerary contexts, meaning burials in contexts that cannot be classified as graves, that increase significantly in the Hellenistic period. At this stage, I would like you to follow me in another way of approaching the evidence, just for this final category to make sense. Although the aforementioned classification of Hellenistic cemetery layouts displays varying degrees of mortuary variability, the way adults are being treated in these categories yields minimal differences. Okay? But these become more elaborate for children, implying that an element of selection and evidently conscious disposal of the dead was in practice. You can't notice many differences to do with the adult population in any of these sites, in any of these cemeteries, but you can notice diverse ways of treating the children. And here I shall stay a little bit longer. By archaeological analysis indicates a drop in the overall number of child burials in the 4th century BCE, a relatively low number in the Hellenistic period, with a marked further decrease in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC. The classical period formal infant and young child burial clusters, in classical period Greece, we get proper child burial clusters, child burials being brought together within classical period cemeteries. Children are buried together in the classical period, be it infants or youngsters. This is not a tendency so easily recognizable in the Hellenistic times, but it does exist. The few such burial clusters that I have been able to locate are, of course, neither that extensive nor clearly separated from adult burials, nor set by city gates, neither in prominent sites, and certainly not clearly separated from the burials of the adults, as it was the case in the classical period. Instead, they are comprised of a limited number of child burials around the burials of adults, whilst being in proximity to each other in the often crowded Hellenistic cemeteries. While some young children received formal burial in communal burial grounds, the number of infants from these cemeteries is nowhere near the expected frequency of the very young. Children died rather easily in the past, even in the modern past, or even more so in the ancient past. If you think about it, in the Hellenistic period, for instance, or as a matter of fact, already from the late classical, Hippocratic corpus informs us, among other things, that there was an instruction to feed newborns and infants honey in the very first days of their life, meaning the very first 7 to 8 days of their coming to this world, modern science has proven that honey is rather toxic if you give it to a baby. Just think of it. If they had to follow these sort of instructions, empirical instructions, of course, okay, set by, let's call them the so-called Hippocratic doctors that first placed in a rather systematic way on a piece of paper or on a piece of papyrus, to be accurate, the exact instructions how to feed your baby, still that instruction was the wrong one. It seems that children of relatively young age may not necessarily be represented in formal Hellenistic cemeteries as a result of conscious adult decisions. The adults did not want these children to be placed, to be buried in cemeteries of the time. Why? Because we can't find them. And we cannot just disprove this, dismiss this by simply saying that the environmental factors or the soil conditions do not allow for infant bones to be preserved. No, this is not always the case, and this is not the only case of infant bones not being preserved for us archaeologists to find. Why? You'll see in a minute. A limited number of intramural child burials, children buried within the fortified areas, which was a no-go for adults in the past, have been found in places like Dimitrias in central Greece, where Hellenistic Anactorum is actually located, in Thessaly, in Athens, in Phaleron, in the island of Rhodes. And these children are individually placed or arranged in minor clusters of few burials next to adults, suggesting that children were sometimes buried intramuros. Okay, so far so good. Even though such a practice may be seen for adults too, sometimes, what is clearly a distinctive attribute of children is their intramural burial within fortified area, within proper domestic space, among houses. That's strange, isn't it? Houses that were being used at the same time, like, of the period of the burial. A handful of child burials, cremation and inhumation alike, have been found in various sites like Athens, Eretria, Sparta, and so on and so forth, within proper domestic space, under the floors of Hellenistic houses. And I'm always talking about Hellenistic child burials under the floors of Hellenistic houses. The custom of placing a child burial close to or inside a house is not common in Hellenistic Greece, however. Another example of a disposal, and this is a form of disposal in a non-funerary context, but a more direct one, which has changed our viewing of child burials in Hellenistic times, came from Athens and then from other urban sites of Hellenistic Greece. In Athens, within the Athenian Agora proper, within the center of the Athenian Agora, a well was discovered. But that was not an ordinary well. That was a well which was sealed in the mid-2nd century BCE. How? Well, by throwing in the remains of at least 262 prematures, neonates, and stillborn babes, as well as animal bones and many pottery sets of mainly pottery amphora. 262 neonates were thrown therein within the very first days of their coming to this world. That was initially a breakthrough in archaeological research of the Hellenistic times. At the beginning, it was discussed as a unique find, something out of the ordinary. But, as always, the final word comes from the earth itself. Either we have ambitions to locate, amazing things. Well, you're all well acquainted with this Alexander the Great romance. Okay, how many have tried to locate it? Thankfully for him, has not been located yet, and let's hope it will remain like that. But many archaeologists have been under treasure hunting to locate, the most significant find with which they will make their career. This is not archaeology. This is treasure hunting. Archaeology comes in with interpretation and proper archaeological ethics being applied. Okay? So, although at the beginning this was a unique find, later research has brought to the light at least 5 more similar wells, water wells, okay, that were sealed at some point in the 2nd century BCE, and by now it's become part of my text. So, all accommodating numerous infant remains, some of them, like the one in Eretria, central Greece, and another one in Aegea, have accommodated thousands, the remains of thousands of infants that were all gradually thrown therein in the 2nd century BCE. And suddenly, all this gap of where all the babies have been buried and all the infants have been buried, and where are all the infants in the Hellenistic cemeteries, instantly got a response. The vast majority of them were not married, well, they never made it, married, but they were never buried in proper Hellenistic cemeteries. They were disposed in non-funerary contexts, like houses and like water wells. And that's not solely a practice that should be looked for in mainland Greece. I wouldn't be surprised if similar deposits would come to the light in Alexandria, Ptolemaic Egypt, Asia Minor, or other places. Why? Because we have similar sort of infant burial treatment of the Roman and later Roman period in other places in the wider Mediterranean world, showing to us that these age groups required specific burial treatment, not just in Greece, not just in the Hellenistic period, but probably even far away from that. And I wouldn't be surprised if you come across such finds in burial grounds in Alexandria and others. So, although varying reasons can lie masked behind each one of these deposits, they illustrate a complex picture in the spatial distribution of burials in the Hellenistic period, where varying modes of age separation was in practice in death. Now, let's return to the fora and to the ritual procession. As soon as the cortege arrived at the graveside, there followed the entombment, the entafiasmos, the actual burial. Okay? It is the lowering of the dead body into their final residence, and essentially the only part so often preserved for us archaeologists to uncover and to analyze. The grave size usually varied according to the size of the deceased buried. Yet, again, child and female burials have often been recovered from quite large and spacious graves, with the female burials being particularly well furnished. We get to see more burial offerings associated with women rather than we do with men in Greek Hellenistic cemeteries. It thus seemed likely that the grave size did not always correspond to the deceased's age or sex, but rather to restrictions imposed by the deceased's status. Children have been traced in rather large tombs, larger than their actual size. So a grave size is not indicative of the age of the deceased buried therein. Okay, we can take it into account, but that's not a vis-a-vis relation. That's not a one-to-one relation. We have to measure other things as well. Already by the 4th century BCE, a tendency towards simple and rather inexpensive grave forms seems to emerge in every region in Hellenistic Greece. Stone slab-covered graves would have definitely been modest. Conglomerate was sometimes used to cover simple pits, although relatively flat stone slabs were more frequent than any other thing. However, burial in tile graves was a very popular way of disposing of the dead already from the 4th century BC. Why? Because tiles were, of course, cheap. They could have been reused, but even if they were actually being produced as tiles to be used for funerary purposes, we do know from economic inscriptions coming from, well, where else? Athens, that each clay tile would cost 1 to 5 obols each, which is not that much in the Hellenistic times. It's not that much. By the Hellenistic period, the dead were buried in tile graves in most parts of the Greek world, likewise in Alexandria, suggesting that the tile grave was probably not a grave form employed by a specific social group, but it was rather a trend imposed by economic and other choices. This is not surprising. At any given moment, a society may include more than one grave types without the people themselves making any distinction between them. Nowadays we call it a fashion. And you know how a fashion works, even nowadays. It always starts from the higher up of the people at the peak of the social ladder, because they want to distinguish themselves from everybody else. And then this fashion starts spreading to the rest. And when the people at the top realize that they cannot distinguish themselves from everybody else, they introduce another fashion. The same is applied in funerary practices. Exactly the same. Especially in the Hellenistic times. And I will share one more thing with you. Why we have such sort of mechanisms in the Hellenistic times? Why? Because the Hellenistic period, throughout the so-called Hellenistic ecumeny, is a rather, how to call it, financially oriented society. It's all about money. This is when coins came to such a wide distribution, coins everywhere. Okay? So the first and foremost thing one should look for when studying any evidence coming from Hellenistic culture should be through the lens of economy and then through culture. Okay? Because in the Hellenistic times, economy dictates culture. Culture can be bought in the Hellenistic times, can be adapted or can be adopted, but only where the money allows it to. However, in addition to the rather simple and unremarkable grave forms I've briefly surveyed with you so far, various monumental tombs, there's one, two, of considerable wealth and splendor were increasingly constructed by the late 4th century BCE, that is, by the early Hellenistic period. However, by the term monumental tombs, here I refer to a rather heterogeneous group of imposing burial monuments. These are not solely Macedonian type tombs. No. The Hellenistic elite was not homogeneous. Okay? Other people had access to such like commodities and funerary practices. The grave at the bottom right comes from a favorite place of mine. It's a chamber tomb, an underground chamber tomb, multi-chambered one, which was found in the modern city of Chania in western Crete. I've become familiar with this place because that's the place where my wife comes from. But anyhow, that place allowed me to bring everything together because I was able to take advantage of my knowledge acquired here in Alexandria and makes promising scholars. Why? Because these grave forms looked very familiar to me. So much familiar that I started looking for similar types where in Alexandria, but not just Alexandria, in the wider northern African coast. Why? Because although they do look familiar, you know, having you're locally on the side of a main corridor, okay, that was accessible through narrow stairs, then through a main door, okay, giving you access to this, with all the names of the deceased painted with charcoal, something very, very usual in Alexandria, above the door frames. These are no common locally. At least these do not correspond to the Alexandrian type of locally. However, they do correspond to something neighboring to Alexandria. They look a lot alike Libyan Cyrenaic locales. And these are, I know you probably think, okay, but Libya and Cyrenaica was under Alexandria. The type, however, this sort of type, was already known to Cyrene, to the cemeteries of Cyrene, already from the 6th century BCE. Alexandria was nowhere near to its existence back then. And these locally are, you know, shafts carved against the wall, okay? A man of my size can actually fit in there, allow me to stand up, but not in the usual customary Alexandrian locally way, you know, on your knees moving in. You can actually move like that, with one major difference. The floor drops. The floor has been carved out, and the deceased is placed therein. It's not on the surface, or at least at the level where the corridor is located. And that's the exact image I traced in Cyrenaic cemeteries of the exact same period of time, and even of the 6th century BC. So, forgive me for saying that in that part of the world, fortunately or unfortunately, is not everything to do with Alexandria. We have other cultural forces being active, local habits, local traditions being preserved and being active, even at the time when Alexandria just overcame everything. Okay. We're almost there, so I hope you're all still alive. So if we regard the effect of permanent monumental tombs were provided with due to their large-scale construction as aiming to memorialize their owner's status as prominent individuals, then these people must have been members of the spending and rather heterogeneous Hellenistic elite. Possessors, or at least representatives of political, religious, economic, or symbolic power, derive their wealth mainly from extensive land holdings. Do remember the Macedonian tomb found in the middle of nowhere from Thrace I've shown to you earlier. But also from trade, taxes, harbor dues, royal donations, etc. And these were people able of even helping a city in military or financial extremity. They had a lot of money, and their family too. Be they an urban bourgeoisie or wealthy landlords, those buried in monumental tombs used the same eloquent means, monumental tombs, for promoting their political and territorial claims in a period, the Hellenistic, where these were of considerable importance. Since some of these tombs contained multiple burials, these claims were also transferable or were not solely relating to one individual, but many more. To the extent that the task of building a large-scale tomb required a long-term commitment, these were not tombs made within a few days, as well as the ability to control resources and coordinate substantial investments. Monumental tombs could also be regarded as places where the economic and social focus of their owners were. So, in simple words, burial at a central place could be, like a monumental tomb, could be equated with reflecting elite regard for urban life, and burial at a remote location with land owning. Okay? The placement next to or even far from modest grave types function as an additional mode of appraisal, creating hierarchical relationships among the dead. Those buried in these tombs were emphatically separated from those buried around them. It is thus made possible to assume that in the Hellenistic period, monumental tombs created a sense of group identity, or even of distinct identity. No matter of, let's move on, this one. No matter of the grave type, supine position with the hands stretched along the torso or crossed on the chest seems to be commoner in the Hellenistic period rather than in any other earlier period, while a pillow stone might rarely be found supporting the head. The wide use of the supine extended position of the dead, as indicated also by the fact that the narrow ends of reused graves are often notched out to accommodate taller individuals, suggests that the harmonic placement of the dead body had become quite a necessity, as if it would ensure a peaceful afterlife or a peaceful passage to the afterlife. And we do know that already from the 3rd century BCE, an individual who's probably very familiar to you, Anaximandros, okay, paid particular attention to human anatomy and how a human body might work and what it means to have, good health and things like that. This happened in Alexandria in the 3rd century, when this tendency I've just described to you started emerging, overcoming everything else. Yet various locations can of course be noted, okay? This is not all white, black and white, it's always gray. Possibly demarcating social groups in death or even manifesting other metaphysical beliefs. Individual inhumations in the Hellenistic period appear to be non-normative. The bodies within the graves display a lack of uniformity in terms of positioning and orientation. Although individual inhumation burial was the norm, multiple burials also exist. The placing of individuals in the same grave does not seem to have always been a solution dictated by prudence, but rather by social conventions. For instance, and among other things, females share significantly more attributes with children than either share with men, while female relatives were probably responsible for preparing the body of an infant and young child, observations suggesting that an association in death may often reflect a relationship in life. In this case, a relationship that seems to be fading away, or at least changing in the Hellenistic period, where the emphasis was turned elsewhere. Among the non-ordinary extended inhumation burials, sometimes we come across rather crucial, complex, individual burials, inhumation burials, like this one. This is a picture taken in the 1950s by an archaeologist working in the city of Thebes, the Greek Thebes, not your Thebes, okay? In the mainland of Greece, where a site which was actually demolished by Alexander the Great, I'm sure you remember the story, sometime in 334. Okay, Alexander went there and simply annihilated the population, demolished the site. Anyhow, life went on after that terminus postquem, and in the Hellenistic cemeteries of Thebes, back in the 50s, the excavators came across this grave. How does that look to you? Strange a little bit, isn't it? How many individuals can you identify? 2. Okay. Where's the second one? Okay. Bottom left. Okay. Does he or she look like an adult? Like a child? Any child? Like coming from any part of the so-called childhood age group? It's rather small, isn't it? It's an infant. It's an infant. Measuring a size of approximately half a meter at depth. You can notice in what bizarre way this infant has been placed therein. And not only that, you can notice the left lower limb, the left leg of the adult slightly moves rightwise in order to create space therein to accommodate an infant. Okay? So far, so good. Do you also notice the alignment of the outer frame of the entire burial complex? You do?
Yeah.
Well done. So far, you have an adult and an infant placed within the same burial trench, apparently, okay, meaning the wider trench, but also being placed within the same wooden coffin. This is why you see this sort of alignment around these two skeletons, with the infant being placed not exactly at the same time as the individual. Am I right? No, I'm wrong. They were placed exactly at the same time. Why? You can see here that the adult individual lower leg remains, it is articulated. We don't have bones scattered all over the place. So the leg was moved when there was flesh on it, there was still flesh on it, to do that in order to create space for the baby. Okay? Does that mean that they were both literally placed on the same day in the grave? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Because a dead body may or may not be decomposed within a few days, depending on environmental factors, depending on soil acidity, and so on and so forth. And we do know that in ancient times, graves were being reopened very often, even from day one, even from after the date of the burial. So what we can actually trace here is a secondary, not necessarily second, a secondary opening of the wooden coffin in order for a baby to be placed there at some time, not that later after the death of the adult individual. And all these observations came by studying archaeological reports, because they are valuable to us. They are valuable to us, okay? But inhumation is not the only rite attested in Hellenistic Greece, as cremation was also practiced, though in a much more limited scale. The small number of non-cremations, as well as their marked presence in urban cemeteries rather than rural, suggests that the rite, cremation rite, was restricted to a few people, mostly living or being associated with urban centers. The rite would require significant preparation and much labor in order to be accomplished with perfection, and at once. The post-mortem glory of the dead, their soul's peace, as well as the cremator's reputation and goals, would have been at stake here. A large quantity of wood had to be piled up, which the deceased was then placed on. Experimental archaeology has shown that successful cremation of a human body requires the burning of about a ton of dry wood, while full cremation is accomplished only after at least 8 straight hours of burning. When cremation was over, remains were buried in situ, like here, the so-called primary cremation burial, or more frequently, some of them were collected and stored in ashes, so-called secondary cremation. We have many examples here. To name a few, the Hadra Ivriya burial, or the wild ground polychromic Ivriya burial funeral rite, among others. Then the urn was placed in the ground on its own, or within a stone-lined thicky, or even, more rarely, in another tomb next to an inhumation. Okay? Back in the early 2000s, I was reading a few lines from a scholar working on burial offerings. And by this, we're moving on to the final bit of this lecture. I'm not going to share her name with you, but she notes that in her study of Hellenistic graves coming from Athenian Keramaikos, which is not an arbitrary cemetery, okay? Hellenistic grave goods, because you know the Athenian Keramaikos has also had Hellenistic graves, numerous ones, excavated by the German Archaeological Institute back in the 50s and 60s, but none of them has been published. And the Hellenistic burial contexts are many more than the classical ones. So she notes, Hellenistic grave goods are not included in my analysis. Why? Since the number of grave goods from this period, the Hellenistic, is too low, too few, to be statistically meaningful. She came across very few offerings in the Hellenistic graves, and she decided not to include them in her analysis of funerary remains from Athenian Keramaikos, because burial offerings were very few. How accurate is that? How ethical is that? An empty grave does not mean that the grave was looted. An empty grave does not necessarily mean that it was empty already from the beginning. Okay? You can put your creative thinking forward. So, although such modesty seems to be a marked tendency for burials throughout Greece, you'll be surprised to hear that nearly 80% of the Hellenistic graves excavated to date, individual graves, okay, I'm not talking about Macedonian tombs now, but common grave types, which are numerous, thousands. 80% of them, that we have been able to date them to the Hellenistic period through contextual analysis and through association with other means, had no offerings at all, or a couple of them. That was a cultural selection that was going on. These were not just looted graves, nor graves of unimportant people. There was a cultural selection of what to place in the grave, and we do know from ancient sources alike that organic things were placed therein. Food, fruits, okay, cakes, wine, honey. Yet, next to these tombs, a few burials indeed, very few burials, stand out with a considerable number and diversity of burial offerings. These are very few in number, and by standing out, I mean from simple vases to terracotta figurines, or even to more imposing offerings made of gold or metal, or even more so, glass. We should not keep forgetting about glass in ancient times, especially from the Hellenistic, late Hellenistic and later periods. The most compelling, important and expensive, if you want the same. Objects in that time were not necessarily made of gold, they were made of glass. Okay? For most burials, the available information suggests that the offerings were placed in the grave, crowded or distributed around the body in no apparent order, or in some cases, they seem to occupy rather conspicuous places in relation to the dead. For instance, here, these two lecane have been turned upside down in a rather conscious manner in order to be placed on the deceased's lower limbs, or even more so, to see something more well known to everyone. Case of coins, where in some of the times, some of the coins were being deposited in graves found in proximity to the skull and may have represented the well-known obolos with which the dead paid the passage money to the ferryman Harry. Careful placement is made more explicit by the position of vases indeed. These may be set upright or upside down in specific spots around the dead body in no apparent order, while some may have been found covering other vases, figurines or smaller vases, indicating a rather deliberate placement. Since many vases were found in upright position and at prominent places in the grave or in relation to the dead, may be possible, if not likely, that these contained their liquid offerings, but only content analysis can prove this claim. Even though the random placement of most vases suggests that placing them in graves with their contents was probably not the norm, the possibility that their contents or their actual offerings were displayed, as we become aware through vase painting of the late classical period, for instance, or even through grave stelae, okay? And then being removed, destroyed, consumed at the graveside, or even symbolically being placed inside or outside the grave, in other words, they were thought to be there, should not be ruled out. To conclude and to wrap this up, Hellenistic Greece, with its great regional diversity, I like this English quite variety of community forms and networks, political trajectories, geographical connections, variable links with long-distance trade routes, sea routes, okay? And inland mountain economies, the role of mystic cults, of course, get an idea from this one, demonstrates considerable regional mortuary variability. The regional and temporal fluctuations noted in the frequency, spatial distribution, and spatial arrangement of burials, in the varying degrees of inclusivity of people in communal burial grounds and of exclusivity from them, should be understood as reflections of shifts in the symbolism of burial within Hellenistic society, and not necessarily as a trustworthy indicator of alteration in mortality rates. The latter is most difficult to analyze since the population of an ancient city's cemeteries is not a direct reflection of the total population of a city. We always keep excavating a segment of the burial ground and not the entire extent of this burial ground in order to have an idea of the population. But still, I think today has become clear that not all people are being buried in a cemetery. Sometimes they're being buried in other places. Okay? Conclusions concerning Hellenistic burials in Greece might change upon future publication of relevant archaeological contexts, with the advent of new discoveries or through the application of more refined dating. And I here mean that it's really hard sometimes to tell what's late Hellenistic food pottery and what's not early Roman. It's rather difficult to distinguish. However, what clearly emerges from this survey of evidence I've shared with you today is the wide degree of variation in what are often termed as customary Hellenistic burial customs. If death is indeed an occasion or opportunity, if you like, for display, individual or communal display in the Hellenistic period, then the meaning of this opportunity, of course, varies not only geographically within the Hellenistic ecumeny, but also chronologically and along dimensions of gender, age, and status. Thank you so much for your time and your passion.
Very well, thank you so much to take us to this insightful journey and the new approach dealing with the ancient materials concerning death practices, to collect data around the grave, not only to concentrate only on the architecture of the tomb itself, its own, and or concentrating on the burial methods in its own, to collect all data around the burials or the deaths. It is an important thing. For myself, I think the funerary patterns discussed in this Hellenistic Greece closely parallel to those attested in Ptolemaic and Roman Alexandria, as you mentioned before. So Alexandria and Necropolis were likewise located also outside the city, often along main roads, and display a wide range of burial forms, from moats locally to elaborate rock-cut tombs. Of course, with the exception of the royal tombs of Alexandria and the Hellenistic queens and kings. In my point of view, finally, I believe that researching this is not only expressing research or reflecting this in itself, but it reflecting life of the lives who built those tombs through social, economical, religious, cultural choices, practices. So let me, please, before opening the discussion for all our audience, let me to introduce a summary for our students in Arabic, a very quick summary about our lecture today. المحاضرة بتلخص عن موضوع الموت والدفن في اليونان الهلينستية، بتناقش الموت وطقوس الدفن في بلاد اليونان خلال العصر الهلينستي من أواخر القرن الرابع حتى القرن الأول قبل الميلاد، بوصف هذا المجال مجال ثقافي واجتماعي معقد ولا يقتصر على كونه مصدرا لدراسة الطبقات الاجتماعية أو الثروة، بل يعكس تصورات المجتمع عن الهوية والمكانة والعلاقات الاجتماعية والطقوس والمعتقدات المرتبطة بالحياة والموت. المحاضرة تبدأ من نقد الاتجاه التقليدي في علم الآثار الجنائزية الذي اعتبر المقابر مجرد مرايا للبنية الاجتماعية، وتؤكد المحاضرة بدلا من ذلك على أن الدفن فعل يقوم به الأحياء، وأن طريقة معاملة الموتى تكشف الكثير عن المجتمع أيديولوجياً وثقافياً، كما تشدد على أهمية التعامل مع السياق الجنائزي بوصفه سياقاً خاصاً ومقصوداً وليس سجلاً محايداً أو تلقائياً للماضي. رغم كثرة المكتشفات الجنائزية من العصر الهلينستي، تشير المحاضرة إلى وجود نقص واضح في الدراسات الشاملة التي تتناول هذه الفترة مقارنة بالعصور السابقة أو العصور الكلاسيكية، حيث غالباً اقتصر البحث على نشر مقابر فردية أو أنواع محددة من المقابر أو اللقى الجنائزية دون ربطها بإطار تفسيري أوسع. تركزت محاور المحاضرة الرئيسية على موقع المقابر وتنظيمها المكاني location، والدراسة بتوضح أن اختيار موقع المقابر كان مرتبطاً بالاعتبارات العملية والطقسية، خاصة تسهيل موقع الجنازة الكفورة. لذلك غالباً ما أقيمت المقابر على الطرق الرئيسية أو في مناطق منبسطة خارج المدن. وتقسم المقابر في المحاضرة إلى عدة أنماط: مقابر حضارية مرتبطة بالمدن الكبرى كثيفة الاستخدام، غنية بتنوع أشكال المقابر والفينري مونيومنتس أو العلامات الجنائزية أو شواهد القبور. مقابر شبه حضارية تقع على أطراف المدن وغالباً ما خصصت لطبقات اجتماعية أقل ثراءً. المقابر الريفية المرتبطة بالمستوطنات الصغيرة والتي تتميز بتنظيم أقل صرامة، دفنات ريفية معزولة غير مرتبطة بتجمعات سكانية، وتفسر على أنها مرتبطة بملكية الأرض أو أصحاب هذه الأرض وأقاموا مقابرهم، حيث يعمل القبر كعلامة للملكية في هذا المكان. كما تشير المحاضرة على ازدياد ظاهرة الدفن في سياقات غير جنائزية خلال العصر الهلينستي، تناولت المحاضرة كذلك كيفية وضع الجسد داخل القبر، وتوضح أن حجم القبر أو نوعه لا يعكس بالضرورة عمر أو جنس المتوفى، بل غالبا ما يرتبط بمكانته الاجتماعية، وتشير إلى انتشار القبور البسيطة خاصة القبور المغطاة بالبلاطات أو القبور المبنية بالقرميد، ووصف اختيار اقتصادي طبقا للحالة الاقتصادية أو الحالة المادية لصاحب هذا القبر. في المقابل ازدهار القبور الضخمة أو ما يسمى بالنصف الجنائزية الضخمة في أواخر القرن الرابع قبل الميلاد، وهي مرتبطة بالنخبة السياسية والاقتصادية، وتستخدم للتعبير عن المكانة والسلطة والذاكرة العائلية. سيادة وضعية الاستلقاء على الظهر للجثمان مع اختلاف اتجاه الرأس والجسم بحسب التقاليد المحلية أو الطرق أو اعتبارات رمزية أخرى. وجود الدفن الفردي بوصفه القاعدة مع وجود دفنات جماعية تعكس روابط عائلية أو اجتماعية. ثالثاً الأطفال والرضع في الطقوس الجنائزية. تولي المحاضرة اهتماماً خاصاً بغياب الرضع وصغار الأطفال عن المقابر الرسمية مقارنة بمعدلات الوفيات المتوقعة، وتفسر ذلك بوصفه اختياراً اجتماعياً لا نتيجة لعوامل بيئية. تشير الأدلة إلى أن دفن بعض الأطفال داخل المنازل أو تحت تشير الأدلة كذلك إلى دفن بعض الأطفال داخل المنازل أو تحت أرضياتها، التخلص من وفاة أعداد كبيرة من حديث الولادة والرضع في الآبار كما في أثينا وميسيني وإريتريا، ارتباط هذه الممارسات بالتصورات الاجتماعية لهوية الطفل، حيث لم يكن الطفل يعترف به عضواً كاملاً في المجتمع إلا بعد بلوغ عمر معين ومروره بطقوس معينة حتى يدفن في المقابر الرسمية. رابع نقطة أو محور من محاور المحاضرة طقس الحرق وتعدد أنماط الدفن. تؤكد المحاضرة على أن الدفن الأرضي كان هو السائد، بينما استخدم الحرق على نطاق محدود غالبا في البيئات الحضرية وبين فئات معينة من المجتمع نظرا لتكلفته العالية وطقوسه المعينة التي تتطلب متخصصين لأداء مثل هذه الطقوس. وقد يجمع رماد الموتى في جرار أو يدفن في نفس القبر مع دفنات أخرى، مما يعكس تنوع الاختيارات الجنائزية. خامس نقطة القرابين والأوفرنز أو اللقاء الجنائزية. وضحت المحاضرة أن العصر الهلينستي في بلاد اليونان يتسم بقدر من نسميه التقشف الجنائزي أو التقدمات القليلة، إلا أن هذا لم يكن مطلقا، حيث توجد تفاوتات واضحة في عدد ونوع القرابين. بعض القبور غنية بشكل لافت مقارنة بقبور فقيرة مجاورة. غالبا ما وضعت القرابين حول الرأس أو الأطراف السفلية للجسد. تظهر أحيانا دلالات رمزية دقيقة مثل وضع النقود قرب الرأس، وهي الأجرة المعروفة اللي بيدفعها الميت علشان يعدي ويوصل لباب هابس عبر المرات بكارون، أو المرايا والمقاشط وغيرها من الأدوات التي تشير إلى هوية المتوفي أو ممارساته الحياتية. تخلص المحاضرة إلى أن طقوس الدفن في اليونان الهلينستية شديدة التنوع إقليمياً وزمنياً واجتماعياً، وأن الموت كان مجالاً للتعبير عن الهوية والمكانة والاختلافات الاجتماعية، لا مجرد انعكاس بسيط لمعدلات الوفيات أو البنية السكانية. كما تؤكد أن فهم هذه الطقوس يظل مفتوحاً للتعديل مع الاكتشافات الجديدة وتطور المناهج العلمية. So we now open the discussion or comments or any question. Our dear students, feel free to ask in Arabic or English as you like.
Or Greek.
Or Greek. To whom it may concern. In Greek or?
The first word would be Greek.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we translate here.
Alicia, in fact, in English, I have much enjoyed and informed by this deep coverage of the types of cemeteries and how dead were placed in the cemeteries and what were the types of the tombs. But due to the limited time of the lecture, you didn't refer to what happens before placing the dead, or the arrangement of funeral before moving to the cemetery, and why old women were responsible for preparing the body before going to the cemetery, and what was the sort of lament. I have read a book, I think it was written by a Greek scholar called Margaret Alexia.
Yeah, back in the 70s.
Yeah, I met her in Leeds in 1982. And it's a very good book.
Indeed.
And I think that literary sources cover this subject. So can you give us a short idea about what happened before? I mean, the arrangement of it, and why old women, especially old women, were doing that.
Thank you so much for your questions, and I think I will begin by stressing out how important Margaret Alexiou's work is on dangerous voices and women's laments. There's only one problem there. She draws her sources from the epic. She starts to treat from there and then moves down to the archaic and classical period. And then she brings into discussion modern day practices, Greek practices. She does not include in her discussion Hellenistic evidence. Why?
Yes, I know.
Because the sources about the Hellenistic sources about the Hellenistic practices are rather careful, are rather silent.
Yeah.
Okay? The evidence we draw from literary sources, mainly the Hellenistic times, mainly comes from funerary legislation. The earliest one, of course, being dated much earlier in time, in the early 5th century. But then again, we have funerary legislation of the 4th, 3rd, and 1st century BC. From various places. The earliest one comes from Delphi, and the 3rd century one comes from Gambri in Asia Minor, and the 1st century BC one comes from Knossos in Crete, if I'm not mistaken right now. That these legislations were advertised not solely by the city or the wider extent of communal organization at the time. Apparently, different social groups could dictate the way their members were to be buried. Be it a society, an entire society, like a city, okay? Or a social group like the Labiade Fratri coming from the Delphi, which, as a matter of fact, they have the most strict funerary legislation, to my knowledge, saying more things about who's not allowed to participate. You should leave out youngsters, newborns, unmarried women should not be accompany the funerary cortege to the tomb, and only elder women, closer relatives, senior members of the deceased's family are allowed in. Okay, that's one thing. So we have evidence coming from funerary legislation. The problem with the Hellenistic period is that we do not have evidence coming from vase painting as we did for earlier periods of time. To be more explicit, the early Iron Age, the archaic period, and the classic. However, we do have painted appearances of the funerary cortege on stelae of the Hellenistic times. Okay? These are not that much, if you ask me, where you can actually see members of the funerary cortege. In most of the times, these are men. Sporadically, an elder woman might appear, but no younger women, implying that the deceased lies somewhere nearby to this funerary lamenting, if you like, group. And these date to the Hellenistic times. Okay, to fill the gap for what was the actual case from the time of the actual death to the beginning of the disease transfer to the cemetery, there we lack information. Okay? And our analysis draws from evidence coming from earlier periods rather than the Hellenistic. Okay? And along these lines, we are able to suggest that the deceased should have been placed within his house on a table, funerary table if you like, okay, facing the door of the house, exactly because we've noticed that on earlier period face painting. So we assume that it was the same practice for the Hellenists. Or the fact that we trace in vase paintings lamenting gestures. For men it's usually this, whereas for women it's usually that.
Or cutting crowns.
Exactly. We do trace that on painting. We are in a little better chances here because we can trace these gestures on funerary, on terracotta figurines from Hellenistic period burials. Okay? We have lamenting women pulling their hair, being associated with an Hellenistic burial. We have again a lamenting elder woman resting against the grave still of one of her family's members, apparently, coming again from an Hellenistic burial context. To wrap this up, Hellenistic sources are rather carried of what was going on between the actual breaking in of death to the beginning of transferring the dead body to the cemetery. Okay? But other sets of evidence are rather informative. And have I replied to all your questions?
Yes,
No.
of course. If you allow me another question?
Yes, yes. If I may, before you proceed, if I may add something, and thank you for bringing this up, because it was something that I briefly mentioned in a rather anecdotological way during my lecture, and you picked it up. Thank you. At some point I said that literary sources sometimes provide us with evidence that should not be followed directly, line by line, by an archaeologist within their archaeological analysis. We give you an example coming from a well-known classical period. Okay? Thucydides, when places Pericles in front of the Athenian gates, talk about this, speak of the funeral legislation at that time. Among other things, he puts Pericles saying that public funeral, the funeral ritual of bringing all the war dead of the previous year together in order to be commemorated for the state of Athens and within a democratic constitution, is a purely democratic practice. And this is why this practice displays the glamour of Athens of the classical period. However, this is not solely an Athenian practice, and archaeological evidence has traced similar sorts of public war dead funerals being associated with aristocratic institutions within the same period of time. So public funeral ritual does not equate democratic constitutions, and sources do not speak of that. That's probably something.
Okay, now I raise this is a very funny question. I'm wondering why were males placed to the west and women to the east?
Okay.
Does it because male dies first? since west means death, while east means life.
As a matter of fact, that's a great idea. That's a great idea, and I'm saying this because Hellenistic period brings, within the Hellenistic period, religious affinities and afterlife anxieties come to the fore in a rather bold manner. And when we talk about religious echoes coming from various contexts in the Hellenistic period, we have to think of not the Homeric geography of the underworld, but of the Platonic geography of the underworld, and even more so of the Orphic and Bacchic geography of the underworld. Now, these are just general terms. Modern day scholars have grouped together different sorts of evidence traced in literary sources, in archaeological references, evidence, and so on and so forth. And I would add a wider one, especially to do with the Orphic and Bacchic religious affinities, because these belong not to the state religion, but to the so-called public. Okay. These are affinities associated with specific social groups, which may differ from each other depending on where they live and how they live. The Western-Eastern orientation of the dead is not homogeneous in the East. We have entire regions following this line, where the males face to the west and the females face to the east, like Macedonia. But we have other regions, like Thessaly, where orientation varies a lot, from site to site. So this immediately, if we are to accept that individual dead orientation associates with religious affinities rather than anything else, is to do with the fact that we deal with regional differences between the religious affinities.
I read it as a literary significance. You know, I'm obsessed by that.
Okay, yeah. That's a crucial point. That's a very crucial point. No, of course not.
It's not a major principle. Maybe in a certain area or a certain field, it's not something common. Yes, but it's not something common, I think.
We have regional variation, okay? And we might have differences within the same cemetery as well.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? But in order to answer such like questions, that's a very critical point. We have to carry out bioarchaeological analysis in order to tell who's male, who's female, and then to see where the skeletons face that. It's not in Athens, for instance. All the roadside burials along the road, the Eralvos, leading to LFCs. Okay? All the dead, all the individuals there, be it males, females, or children, are oriented in such a way as to face the Eralvos, with their legs towards the sacred way. So,
If we come to the placing infant beside a dead, an old man or woman, it is done here in Egypt, but for a spiritual purpose, not for the area, because of the area, the small area or something like that. But it's done here.
very interesting. Thank you for sharing this. That's very thank you.
I don't know how to thank you for this very comprehensive and very covering, this very good coverage of the main outlines of burials and tombs in Hellenistic Greece. Actually, we learned much. Thank you very much. Now I'm discovering the new talent ranked by is that you are a very, very talented teacher. Let's say this. So I don't have a question, but maybe I have some kind of reflections about what you have told us and told us. First, related to the question of Dr. Fuad about what happens before, I think we also must ask what happens after. Because actually the practice, I'm sure that the three main topics of your lecture did not include the practices themselves, the funerary practice, either before or after, but I think that the practices that were prevailing in the Hellenistic times after the disposition of the body into the various place, I think these are to be found and to be analyzed from the East, especially from Alexandria and Egypt. This is one thing. The other thing is about the lockery, the Cyrenaican and those in Chania, and again in early Alexandrian tombs, namely Shadri and Mustafa Basha. This type of lockery, not all the lockery in the Hellenistic world are similar, of course. But this is the earliest type we know from Hellenistic times and in Cyrenaica before. These are originally from Egypt. Asasif tomb is the same type of this lockery. And it again appears in Mason's art. And when in Sharqi, you remember well with me, that the locally in Pojayan's egg are different, and also in Theodeclos Hall are completely different than any other locally appear inside Sharqi or outside in Mustafa Kamel or some other cemetery. Because this is a new development or simplification of the lockery in order to accommodate more corpses and to have space for concentrated mortality afterwards. So, in my very humble, the early type of lockery is kind of compartments, not lockery. These were compartments in order to accommodate one or more dead person. But then it became the simplified lockery that we know from everywhere, beginning from Alexandria, beginning. Then we find it everywhere in roads and the islands and everywhere. So I think there must be a very comprehensive and surveillance study of lockery in the Hellenistic world, actually. But then there is also an important big difference between Hellenistic Greece, as far as the funerary context is concerned, and or Alexandria. The one in Greece, the concept in Greece before the Hellenistic period was not a tomb or a monument that is used as for a tomb or built to function as a tomb, but it's cemeteries. Cemeteries sometimes with lavish tomb stele, to the extent that Demetrius of Phaleron decreed once that to not to make such sculpted stele because they of economic reasons, and these of course were the main influence or the main inspiration for the Alexandrian sculptors and carvers of the tombs, which is the Attic tomb. But these were collective burials, collective tombs, cemeteries, only or on the sides of main roads around the cities or outside the cities. In Hellenistic Egypt, the case is different. The case is cemeteries for individual burials or for collective burials or for individuals that turn soon into collective burials, not on roads, not with stele that asks the passers-by to stop and pray for the memory of this one or that one, but these were a kind of place for practicing the homage and all the respect and sanctification of the dead person inside this place before the burial and long after the burial, in occasions in each year or in the commemoration days of the burial. So this is a main difference. Tombs everywhere, Macedon, Greece, everywhere, were closed after burial. Any practice is far from the tomb itself afterwards, even if it happened. But in Alexandria, no. The tombs were made in order to remain open, in order to remain remembering the dead, in order to remain practicing something in honor of the dead. That's why these practices became the main feature of Alexandrian funerary art, which again spread all over the Hellenistic period.
Thank you. Thank you for all this wealth of information and for sharing your thoughts. Yeah, take care. Okay, I should probably begin from the end of it. Well, first of all, this is evidence illustrating the case in Hellenistic Greece, mainland Greece, and I was rather conscious to focus on mainland Greece rather than the islands or the Aegean, exactly because I had to deal with many other things there, which to my mind would have brought us closer, as the case in Alexandria. That's one thing. I would have to disagree with the fact that the Greek tomb, yes indeed, it's being sealed as soon as the burial is over, but I would disagree with the fact that it was left there to be, and no return to the grave was happening immediately after the burial was concluded, or later in time. We do know from classical period evidence, for instance, of white leaky foliage, for instance, white brown leaky foliage, where these visits to the tomb are usually depicted there of individuals or of the dead himself appearing outside a funerary monument, implying that some sort of visiting the tomb was happening for libations. That's one thing. The other thing is that although traditional, established in a way, scholarly viewing of Macedonian type tombs from mainland Greece used to think that as soon as the deceased was placed therein, the tomb was sealed and covered by a tumulus. To my mind, this is simply wrong. For the fact that the vast majority of these tombs accommodate multiple burials, and burials that occurred not necessarily immediately after the first individual was placed therein. And we do know that from the very few pottery offerings that have been published. Because you'll be surprised to remember that although we do know of a large number of Macedonian tombs in mainland Greece, the actual evidence that allows us to date them precisely, like pottery and coins, have not been systematically treated ever since this sort of evidence came to the light in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Okay? And the vast majority of the Macedonian time tombs that came to the light recently are all looted. Okay. Now, there are Macedonian type tombs in Macedon where they have some sort of square yard right in front of the facade. And that's where the dromos ends up, We have this square in front of the main entrance, and then the tumulus, the tomb follows. This square looks like an assembly, like a gathering point of some sort. Not necessarily to provide empty space for the tomb's facade, because there is no architectural facade there. For rituals. Nobody has paid attention to that, or at least the kind of attention we want to have in such aspects. So I'm pretty convinced that all the tombs in the Hellenistic times in mainland Greece were being revisited, and certainly were being reopened at some point, either for the deposition of another burial or for the rearrangement of the bones within ritual practices involving liquid offerings or even fire rituals. We have indications about that. You are better placed here in Egypt exactly because the emphasis has been placed on such like interaction with the dead in a post-burial mainly context. Okay? Which brings me to my second point. I remember that us discussing this again. Monumental tombs, these impressive underground impogia found around Alexandria and other places, of course, which apparently are being dated within the 3rd century BCE onwards. Okay? These do not correspond to the early generations of newcomers to Egypt, either from Greece, from Asia Minor, from Cyprus, in order for them to become inhabitants of the later city of Alexandria. I'm pretty convinced by pottery evidence, which we came across in Shafi as well, that these people were buried in the simpler forms, the simple pit graves, excavated by Breccia at the beginning of the early.
Yes, they are earlier than the Egyptian.
Much earlier, and these types are much simpler than those appearing from the mid-3rd century onwards.
Yes.
So I think what we face in cases like Shafi, we have another sort of cultural arrangement of the graves, of the earlier graves on the surface, which in the case of Shafi were excavated by Breccia, and then something else goes on from the 3rd century onwards. And here I want to stress Bunakaza's paper on Mustafa Kemal, exactly, where he's deemed there, by the use of geophysics, if I'm not mistaken, traced road networks, roads, on which the podia face and are arranged. These are roadside podia, according to Bunakaza, because he draws lines there, and he says that these 5 tombs have a linear arrangement exactly because one of their sides or both of their sides are roadside.
Inside the cemetery.
Inside the cemetery.
Yes.
Inside.
It was a very place, the cemetery.
Okay. But there
And
were
all
roads
were
there.
inside the cemetery.
Yeah. But there were roads there. Roads.
Yes, yes.
So again, that eases accessibility to these monuments. And I think.
Excuse me, and even Strabo spoke about the necropolis as having roads and gardens and such. So the cemetery has its own layout and planning inside. It's the reflex.
As in Greece.
Yes.
And these roads are to do with accessibility. Okay? Be it urban roads or funerary roads. Now, on the locally, and thank you for bringing this up, and especially I was not aware of the Asisif too. Okay, thank you for saying this.
Chefs who is first spoke about this
Okay.
relationship, and then Nelson's Island shed the light to the assassination.
My point here was simply to disassociate the localus as per se, as a localist type, from Alexandria, Hellenistic Alexandria itself. Okay? And from my survey of evidence, okay, I traced something earlier in Cyrene, and I said that this thing exists before Alexandria came to Egypt. And exactly, it's in Egypt. However, I forgot to mention that the Chania version is in a way two-storied one. There are cuttings along the narrow edges of the lower shaft within this loculus structure, where wooden beams were placed, on which tiles were set for another burial. On another burial.
Let's have in mind one point, only one point of difference again. When we make this survey or this study of the Hellenistic Greece practices and books, that in Alexandria, the people who were buried, at least in the early phase of burial places in Alexandria, were not Egyptians. They were Greeks or other nationalities. And they were dealing with land that is new to them, with a culture that is completely new to them, and they had in mind to concentrate and focus on expressing their original identity and culture. But in Greece, they don't have this aspect at all. In Greece, they are in their own lands. So they are practicing something that everybody knows, that everybody practices, and this is the ordinary tradition of the people and of the culture. But in Alexandria, they wanted to express their own culture in a foreign land, so it is more concentrated, at least at the beginning.
Yes.
Of the Hellenistic.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mona, for your comments. Rahman.
Just I want to note about infant burials. Unfortunately, I didn't found much infant burials in Alexandria, but the very few which I found, they were highly protected. I mean, they were mainly in jars or in a certain positioning in the cemeteries. But as for the concept of burying the infant in the houses, more than 10 years ago when I was excavating in Comet Factory in Mitrohina, and this was the first experience for me to find an elephant burials in a settlement. The site is dated to the end of the late period, the intermediate, sorry, the beginning, the end of the intermediate period and the beginning of the late period. And we found an elephant burial in the settlement area. And I know from my colleagues that, and it was the first time for my experience, that even in Egypt, in the half of the last centuries, this was the attitude in the villages to bury the infant and the child in the houses, but with another concept, not as you have said that because they are not a complete member in society, just to keep the children or the close to his family, or to be close to his mother, or for the lament for his mother. So this is was one of the explanations that we didn't find a lot of infant burials in the cemeteries.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I think also there is another example in Bodo, covered shape, I think in the domestic areas that found some burials.
This was the attitude in Egypt, not only Hellenistic, I mean, in rural, as I said, in Comet Factory, it was in the Quranic period, it was the same. So it seems that it is a social attitude.
So far, if you have any more questions, have you traced any proper child cemetery, child burial grounds, as far as you know?
In Alexandria, I found only one child burial in Rushdie, nearby Mustafa Basha, in a cemetery, but with a special care. It was buried in a jar.
The only case I'm aware of comes from Gabari. Gabali.
Jabali, I know that the French have found a lot,
But these
but
were
this was the only case I have found.
We participated in excavations in Terra Santa, in the nursery of the governorate, in order to detect what about the alabaster tomb, such things. In this nursery, I think, as far as I remember, it's not published, unfortunately, was a child area for child burial, Christians, and late, not later, but all the French or trenches affected were children, only children, with some Christian signs.
Any more questions or comments? Okay, maybe for the
Speaking of the infant
raise
remains,
your voice.
okay. Speaking of the infant remains, you can't hear me, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. ممكن أقف هنا؟ قربي تعالي.
خليك نصفك قاعدة كده
اوكي.
تعالي.
اوكي.
أنا speaking the mic.
لا, it's okay.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I can. Thank you.
So speaking of the infant remains, from the understanding, I got that they are missing for infant and adult, right?
Yes.
So was there any other ostracized or outcast group? Like, was that a common practice when you want to reject a social group? Yeah.
That's a $1 million question. Where are
I
we?
like slaves working.
Yeah, exactly. I got it. That's a great question, as a matter of fact. What's going on with the social outcasts? Indeed, where are all the slaves being buried? Where are all the expats being buried? Where are all those thrown out of the city limits being buried? I have no answer to that. However, what I can tell you is that I'm not convinced that these infants are social outcasts, okay? Nor are the victims of an epidemic or pandemic episode. Because in some of them, bioarchaeological analysis have been carried out and have died out of apparently natural causes. Okay, there were no any sort of infections or diseases that actually led them to death. So we don't know. We actually don't know why they died. Suffocation, perhaps, doesn't leave a mark on bones, or exactly what sort of mindset dictated this practice of placing, I wouldn't dare to say throwing, because this shows a conscious action, okay? And all these water wells are placed within the actual urban centers of these cities. The one in Athens is located within the Athenian Agora. That was a site accessible and visible to anyone. So these infants were deposited therein for what? For mystical reasons, for reasons to do with the fact that a water well, apart from an economic asset when being active, it can equally turn into a faster way to the underworld, if you think about it. And if you push it a little bit further, indeed, and as macabre as that may sound, an infant is closer to death than we are as adults. And because it was just being born, okay? It was not just being introduced to the society of the living. It had many years to live in before it became an active social member. So an infant is closer to death and darkness in the underworld than any age group in this group.
So we cannot assume that they are missing.
No. Not in all cases.
Yeah,
Not in all
just
cases.
I understand that there are a lot of people actually that
Yeah.
buried their loved
Yeah.
ones in their houses,
Yes.
in the gardens.
Yeah. You can't draw a strict line there, but it does show a communal practice being going on, because that's a communal resting place. There was a well, accessible to many families apparently. Everyone was aware of these wells being used in such a manner. Okay. And we don't have clear indication that these infants could be considered as outcasts or the lesser important members of society. I would go for those not being yet members of that society, which does not equate a lesser status necessarily. Well, slaves, that's another story. We don't know where slaves are being buried. There's only one cemetery in Greece, like a proper burial ground, near the quarries of Lavrion, where Athenian coins were minted, and their colleagues from the Greek Ministry of Culture some decades ago came across a burial ground of approximately 500 individuals of different age groups, being buried in rather simple manners, and all carrying traumas from heavy work, manual work. Okay. So these are probably slaves.
I think we have also to have in consideration the infantilities, killing,
Yeah, that.
which was practiced in certain periods and in certain places.
Yes. This is an evidence coming from literary sources initially. To be honest with you, I'm not entirely convinced that this is the practice we're talking about for the Hellenistic period, because the sources describe something to do with earlier than the classical period. So we don't know if that custom actually. I'm not convinced. There's a huge gap there. But absolutely right. There is that scenario as well. Yeah.
So, any other questions today? No? Yeah.
All right.
He's one of our students. He was teaching.
What is the difference between individual burial and collective burial, and what does each reflect?
What does it?
Each reflect.
Okay. Individual burial is placing an individual, okay, person within a grave. Okay. A communal grave, communal burial, if you like, is placing multiple, many more individuals within the same grave context. Now, this might mean that you get, for instance, 10 skeletons within the shaft. But have you been to Shakti?
Yes.
You have.
Yes.
Have you been to Boyumei then? And you have been to these side chambers with all the locally cut against the walls, right?
Yeah, right.
So each chamber represents a multiple burial. Okay? That's a sum of several individual burials. But they have all been placed within the exact same chamber. That's a multiple burial. It's not individual. Okay? You
Yes.
might get that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Pleasure.
But it is not necessary that at the same time. All the collective, not at the same time. Sometimes different times. في أسئلة تانية? Any questions or comments? So at the end, I would like to thank the administration of our University of Alexandria and also the administration of our faculty, Professor Hellenistic Greece, for facilitating everything for the visit of Professor Dimakis to our department of Roman archaeology and studies. I also would like to thank all my lead professors at the department and our junior staff for their interest and their contribution to this visit. I would like also to thank Jupiter Society students for organizing all our activities. Thank you. Thank you for Ayman for designing all the posters for your lecture and everything, our junior staff, Ayman. Thank you at least finally to you. Thanks for contributing to with your visit to our department, and I hope so that of course we will continue as we plan in more future collaboration between our two institutions. So at the end, let me introduce something on behalf of our department staff for you. Thank you.